The world lay in a forced silence, a cosmic vacuum where the universe's breath seemed suspended after the roar of judgments that had torn the veil of reality. There were no trumpets sounding, nor the tremor of imminent destruction, only the tense expectation that precedes the manifestation of the sovereign design. On the rocky island of Patmos, where the prophet John served his exile, solitude was a heavy cloak, the punishment of the wicked for their zeal devoted to the word. He, the last of the apostles, felt the weight of men's abandonment, but not the desertion of his faith, for the trial had become the furnace where his devotion was purified, and the turbulent sea that surrounded him was the only witness to his profound suffering and his unwavering hope in the coming justice. In that desolate place of stones and winds, his soul awaited the sign, knowing that the Eternal One never leaves a faithful one without his comfort or his mission. Behold, breaking the monotony of exile and the despair of the world, the fabric of the sky was torn, not in destructive fury but in glory that defied the very logic of creation. From the immense firmament descended a figure whose scale subverted the entire architecture of the landscape, a colossal angel, not as a subtle emissary but as a manifestation of uncreated authority. His body did not move by gravity, but was carried by a living cloud, pulsating with the energy of the celestial ether itself, and upon his brow rested a resplendent rainbow, the ancient symbol of the covenant, now clothed in the threat of a judgment that would no longer tolerate the iniquity of men. That spectacle was the harbinger that the age of patience was inexorably drawing to a close, and the heart of the exiled prophet, though seized by reverent terror, was inflamed with the certainty that the faithfulness of his Lord would be vindicated. The angel did not seek a temple or a sacred mountain to land upon, for he claimed the entirety of creation as his immediate domain. In a gesture of unheard-of power, one of his massive legs rested upon the raging sea, subduing the fury of the waters, and the other was firmly planted upon the earth, solidifying his authority over the land of mortals. In that instant of suspension, the entire globe became the altar of the imminent oath, and the sea and the earth, formerly elements of separation and boundary, were united under the aegis of his sovereignty. In his hand, the celestial herald carried a small book, the little book, open and unsealed, of modest appearance, but whose spiritual weight was incalculable, containing truths that heaven was ready to deliver, but which would be bitter for whoever carried them. When the angel uttered his voice, there was no subtle echo, but a primeval and thunderous noise, described by the prophet as the roar of a lion bursting forth from the depths of the cosmic jungle. The power of that summons shook the foundations of exile and drew from the heavens the immediate response of seven thunders, who spoke in languages that only the Spirit could discern, uttering words laden with secrets, divine messages, and decrees from on high. The prophetic impulse, inherent in John's soul, made him try to record every syllable, every mystery revealed by the thunders, but a more powerful voice coming from the invisible throne intercepted his pen. "Seal up the things which the seven thunders have spoken, and do not write them down," commanded heaven, imposing the insurmountable boundary between what should be revealed to men and what belongs exclusively to God's eternal design, reaffirming that human wisdom will never encompass the totality of divine truth. The divine interruption was an act of profound humility imposed upon the prophet, teaching him that blind obedience precedes knowledge, and that faith is sometimes the acceptance of the inscrutable mystery. However, the spectacle was far from over. The colossal angel, in a gesture that seemed to encompass the limits of the firmament, raised his right hand high and uttered the most solemn oath that heaven and earth could witness. He did not swear by his own glory, but by him who lives forever and ever, the eternal creator of all that exists, he who gave form to the sky, the dry land, and the raging sea that imprisoned John. That oath was the declaration that the waiting was over, that the time of patience was exhausted. "There will be no more delay," cried the voice. The gravity of that cosmic pronouncement made John's soul tremble, for he understood that the mystery of God, the purpose announced to the ancient prophets and kept within eternity, was rapidly moving toward its final climax. Redemption and judgment would meet at a point of no return, and the history of humanity would be sealed by the acts of divine justice and mercy. That oath was not merely a prophecy of ending, but a direct summons, an act that imposed upon the exiled prophet a responsibility that surpassed his own suffering and his mourning for the seemingly lost cause. He, the small man on the island of stones, should now rise to be the mouth of heaven amidst earthly chaos. It was at this peak of cosmic tension that the voice of the firmament, no longer like the roar of a lion, but as a personal and direct command, called the prophet. John felt the urgency invade his spirit, and suddenly small and fragile, but driven by unwavering faith, he approached the colossal figure, which transcended the dimensions of matter. He, the exile, did not hesitate to obey the call, for his suffering and his faithfulness had prepared him for this moment. He came before the angel and asked him for the small open book, accepting beforehand any burden or pain that this revelation might bring, for his only motivation was obedience to the sovereign purpose, and his trial had purified him of any worldly fear. The subsequent order that emanated from the celestial herald was disconcerting and definitive. Take it and eat it. He was not told to read, to transcribe, or merely to contemplate the words, but to incorporate the message, to make the spiritual content of the little book an intrinsic part of his being. The book was not a mere piece of information, but a living covenant. John, obedient and without questioning, received the volume. Upon touching it, he felt not the roughness of the parchment, but the overwhelming weight of divine truth. He brought it to his mouth, and the first sensation was one of indescribable delight, the pure sweetness of the finest honey, a taste that represented the honor of the calling, the beauty of the revelation, and the privilege of being the spokesperson of the Most High. It was the sweetness of the promise before the cost. The heavenly sweetness, however, was only the prelude, an ephemeral blessing that served to contrast with the harsh reality of the prophetic ministry. The account of the trial is not completed with the initial delight, but with the painful transformation. No sooner had the little book gone down the prophet's throat than the sugary delight gave way to a corrosive sensation, a fire that burned from within. What was honey in the mouth became bitter gall in the stomach, a pain that was not physical but spiritual, a torment of the soul that understood the duality of the word. Revelation is sweet in its origin and in its promise of redemption, but bitter and painful in its execution, for knowing the future implies not only final glory, but the announcement of implacable judgment and the suffering inherent in the confrontation against the powers of iniquity. In that moment of profound and solitary agony, John felt the bitterness of the prophecy merge with his own essence. The book had not been digested but assimilated, and his stomach became the repository of the most difficult truth. He felt the weight of the destiny of entire nations, the mourning for lost souls, and the inevitability of divine justice against the oppressors of the earth. This was the humiliation, the test of faith, the revelation of divine purpose manifested in a single act. The prophet would no longer be merely an observer, but the sufferer who carried the pain of the world in his womb. His trial in exile was the training. The ingestion of the book was his painful ordination for the final mission. The contrast between sweetness and bitterness established the core of his journey of spiritual transformation. The prophet, once merely a man suffering from the injustice of exile and old age, emerged from that experience as a bearer of divine fire, a herald whose insides burned with a truth that could not be silenced. His solitude was no longer merely geographical, but spiritual, for he now carried a bitter secret that definitively separated him from the vain pleasures of the world and aligned him with the immutable design of the eternal. The pain was the cost of the covenant, and the bitterness in his belly was proof that his mission would be marked by tribulation and incessant confrontation. But the inner fire of the word was also his unbreakable protection. The angel, seeing the prophet prostrate, but transformed by the fire of the little book, uttered the final declaration, the sentence that gave meaning to all his trial and isolation. You must prophesy again concerning many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. The exile had ended, not by the decree of an earthly emperor, but by the sovereign order of heaven. John's triumph would not come from immediate physical liberation, but from the faithfulness of having accepted the burning mission. That mandate was his legacy and his prophecy, the certainty that the voice of the exile, previously silenced and ridiculed by the powerful, would now speak with the authority of one who carries the word of God within his own being. The injustice of men had been eclipsed by divine justice manifested in the irrevocable call. In that monumental moment where revelation merged with personal pain, the figure of John, the old exile, underwent its definitive metamorphosis. He was no longer the beloved disciple, reclining on the Master's breast, but the prophet of fire, whose soul had become the living scroll of God. The contrast between his aged body and the spiritual vigor that burst forth from his very core was vivid and striking. The before was mourning on the rocky island, the after was the inner flame of judgment and promise. That act, the eating of the little book, was not mere symbolism. It was the forge that prepared him for the final confrontation against the powers that lay in the darkness of the world. The sweetness of acceptance gave him courage. The bitterness of the mission gave him the relentless strength to announce the end of times and the establishment of the kingdom. The omnipresent narrator saw and reveals the depth of the design. John's ordeal on Patmos was not a punishment, but a strategic isolation, necessary so that his mind and spirit might be completely stripped of worldly distractions. The injustice of exile, perpetrated by the blind and arrogant empire, served only as a catalyst for the manifestation of the higher will, while the antagonists, the skeptics in Rome and the opponents of truth, mocked his imprisonment and celebrated the apparent silence of the last apostle. Heaven was preparing him with glory, investing him with an authority that would surpass all temporal thrones and dominions. The malice and skepticism of the oppressors would be confronted by the revelation that now burned in the heart of the prophet. The giant angel, whose leg was on the sea and the other on the land, needed no further words. His oath had marked the final timeline, and the delivery of the little book to John was the seal of the renewed covenant. The prophet, now in return and redemption, understood that his role was not that of a mere chronicler, but that of a spiritual combatant, armed not with an iron sword, but with the consuming word. The vision of the angel whose face shone like the sun and the rainbow of glory above his head was the unshakable guarantee that God's faithfulness was inevitable. Triumph was not a possibility, but the fulfillment of a promise that had been inscribed in the prophet's very being with the fire of bitter and sweet truth. The mission that lay before John was colossal and terrifying. To prophesy again about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. This meant that after his return from exile, his voice, previously confined to his small community and the rocky island, would echo with the force of the lion's roar he had heard. The skepticism of kings and the arrogance of empires would be confronted by the unwavering conviction of a man who carried the fire of prophecy in his belly. The triumph of his faith was not a personal victory, but divine justice manifesting itself through his obedience. He would leave Patmos to fulfill what heaven had commanded, certain that the book burned within so that the light could shine without, and his preaching would be the inevitable fulfillment of the eternal purpose. With the conclusion of the Epiphany and the angel's return to the glory that had begotten him, the prophet did not find himself plunged into a void, but enveloped by a new and terrifying fullness. The landscape of Patmos, formerly the scene of his solitude and mourning, became the cradle of his prophetic rebirth. The bitterness that burned in his stomach allowed no rest or complacency, acting as a constant reminder of the cost of revelation. He could not forget the pain he carried, for it was this pain that gave him the authority to denounce the injustice of the world and announce the imminent redemption. The Eternal One did, in fact, have other plans for his exile, transforming the prison into a sanctuary and humiliation into anointing. Months passed, their hours filled not with lamentation, but with the feverish transcription of the visions that followed the ingestion of the little book. The old apostle, whose physical strength was waning, received an inexhaustible spiritual vigor for his mission. The oppressors, in their temporal myopia, thought that the silence of Patmos was proof of the failure of his faith, but the narrator reveals that this silence was the incubation of judgment. The empire that had banished him was, ironically, guaranteeing the solitude necessary for the final word to be forged in Nicaea, the fire of trial. The contempt and indifference of the antagonists were, in truth, unconscious tools in the hands of the sovereign, so that John's legacy would be unbreakable. In that season of drought and mourning for God's people, John's unwavering faithfulness became an invisible but powerful beacon. He did not seek worldly liberation, but justification by faith. The contrast in his existence was now total. Outwardly, the frail and marginalized man. Inwardly, the unshakable rock bearing the destiny of the world. His obedience in eating the book, even without understanding the full extent of the pain that would follow, was the culmination of his surrender, an act of blind trust that sealed his covenant with the divine purpose. The pain was evidence that the word was alive and active, and his future preaching would be marked by the urgency and authority that only direct experience of the supernatural confers. The inner cry for divine justice, which was once a plea, transformed into a prophetic certainty. The exiled prophet, recalling the face of the angel brighter than the sun, and the weight of the oath that declared the end of the waiting period, felt the majesty of divine intervention. He was being prepared to confront kings and peoples, not with arguments of human wisdom, but with the revelation of him who is, who was, and who is to come. The triumph would not only be his departure from the island, but the eternal echo of his words, the testimony that would remain when the thrones of his oppressors had crumbled to dust. He who had felt the bitterness of prophecy would be the bearer of the sweet final victory. Divine justice, which the prophet so longed for, did not manifest itself with lightning and thunder upon the arrogant capital, but with the silent return of the exile, carrying the chronicle of the end. When, by the sovereign will that moves the hearts of kings and emperors, the decree of his exile was revoked, for the Eternal uses even the inconstancy of the powerful for his purposes, John did not return as a man begging forgiveness, but as a messenger invested with unparalleled power. His body, more bent by years and trial, contrasted with the fire that burned in his eyes, the unmistakable flame of one who saw the Eternal face to face and bore the bitter weight of his book. The skepticism and mockery of his antagonists, those who rejoiced in his forced silence, turned to cold shock at his return. They expected to find a broken elder whose faith had withered in isolation. Instead, they found a prophet whose authority transcended earthly logic. The contrast between before the solitary exile and after the flaming herald was public and undeniable proof of divine intervention. The malice of his enemies who had condemned him to oblivion was thwarted by the revelation of purpose that had transformed him into an indisputable voice for the nations. His ministry in the period following his release was not marked by lengthy philosophical debates, but by the solemn proclamation of the truths that burned within him. He prophesied about peoples, nations, and kings with eloquence forged in suffering and conviction fueled by the fire of the little book. His voice, once gentle and familiar, gained the resonance of the lion's roar he had heard on Patmos. As we continue on this journey, subscribe and walk with us through each new tale, and leave a like to support heroes of faith. The bitterness he carried was his weapon against complacency and iniquity. The sweetness of the promise was the consolation offered to the faithful who, like him, had endured the trial. That was the triumph of faithfulness, the victory of a man who had exchanged worldly comfort for the pain of eternal truth. John's legacy was not sealed by stone monuments or golden crowns, but by the book he wrote, the final chronicle of Revelation, which began with the vision of the giant angel. His life and work became the testimony of the covenant, living proof that obedience and unwavering faith, even amidst the deepest trial and apparent abandonment, culminate in the inevitable fulfillment of divine purpose. The story of the exile, the angel, and the bittersweet book became a sacred epic, a tale of divine justice that uplifts morals and inspires reverence, showing that the destiny of a believer is shaped not by the hands of their oppressors, but by the higher will. The shock and in some cases the belated repentance of his antagonists confirmed that the prophecy was being fulfilled. John's proclamation was not an abstract philosophy, but a sentence of destiny, and this generated in the hearts of the kings and leaders who had previously scorned him a mixture of indignation and growing terror. They found themselves confronted, not by an army, but by the word which, like fire, consumed the foundation of their earthly authority. The narrator reveals that the envy and malice of the antagonists intensified, for the triumph of the one who had been humiliated was the hardest proof of the futility of their own ambition. They tried to silence him with threats, but how could they stifle a voice that carried the roar of the seven thunders and the bitterness of prophecy within it? In that time of great turmoil, marked by the rise and fall of thrones and the relentless persecution of the faithful, John's chronicle became the map to hope and the manual of spiritual resistance. The legacy he established was not a mere set of teachings, but a prophecy in action. The giant angel had sworn that there will be no more delay, and John, in every sermon, made that declaration a present reality. The triumph was his persistence in prophesying, his refusal to retreat in the face of fear, even knowing that the content of the book was bitter, foreshadowing suffering for the world and for the messengers of truth. In the period following his liberation, the prophet fulfilled his mandate to prophesy to many peoples and nations and languages and kings, not only through long journeys, but by disseminating his work, which traveled faster and farther than he himself could go. The account of the trial on Patmos, the vision of the angel, and the eating of the little book were told and retold, reinforcing the belief that the manifestation of faith amidst adversity is the only bridge to divine justice. John's humiliation was the fertile ground for his glory, and his faithfulness, the beacon that guided the nascent church through the dark ages. The final contrast between the arrogance of those who exiled him and the power of his prophecy was a perpetual lesson in redemption and judgment. The oppressors, trapped in their temporal and immediate vision, could not conceive that destiny was not determined by their decrees, but by the higher will. The shock, and in some cases, the belated repentance of his antagonists confirmed that the prophecy was being fulfilled. John's life, which began in apparent abandonment and culminated in supreme spiritual authority, was living testimony that the triumph of faith is always an inevitable fulfillment, and that the pain of trial is the price paid to bear the sweet and bitter truth of the eternal. The omniscient narrator, observing the unfolding of the years, saw how the little book burning within John shaped his character and his message. There was no longer room for the doubts that plague ordinary men. The bitterness of prophecy had consumed all uncertainty, leaving only the flame of unwavering conviction. He spoke of glory with the authority of one who had seen it, and of judgment with the pain of one who had borne it. His teachings became the pillar of faith, the anchor that held the souls of the faithful amidst the storms of persecution that followed his preaching. The trial on Patmos, which should have been his end, became the beginning of his most powerful prophetic manifestation. In that season of drought and mourning for the world, where iniquity seemed to triumph, John's narrative of the giant angel and the final oath instilled in the hearts of the righteous a renewed reverence for divine justice. The symbolism of the angel's leg over the sea and the other over the land, signifying complete dominion over all elements and nations, was a constant reminder that the power of empires is transient, but the sovereignty of God is eternal. The faithful, inspired by their faithfulness amidst the humiliation, found the strength to endure their own test of faith, knowing that redemption was the ultimate purpose of all suffering. The antagonists, who previously despised his faith as the superstition of an old exile, saw their skepticism crumble before the accuracy and power of his prophecies. The shock was undeniable. They witnessed with their own eyes the fulfillment of the words of the man they had tried to silence. What was ridiculed as the lament of a prisoner became the herald of destiny. Divine justice did not need an army to manifest itself. It used the voice of a man who submitted to the pain of revelation, showing that true authority emanates from obedience, not from brute force or social position. John's legacy was not merely the record of the vision, but the model of spiritual transformation. He taught that the word of God, even when bitter, is the only nourishment that empowers the prophet for the mission. The before and after of the trial was his most powerful sermon. The pain and solitude of the island prepared him for the majesty of the intervention. His triumph, his victory over exile and forced silence, was tangible proof that the promise is inevitable and that the Eternal's design will be fulfilled, regardless of the will and malice of men. He who had been humiliated was exalted to be the voice that would echo until the end of time. The drama of transformation experienced by John reverberated in his posture and words. It was not the eloquence of a trained orator, but the solemn authority of a prophet whose soul had been fused with bitter and sweet truth. The weight of the little book, which manifested itself like fire in his entrails, gave him an urgency that allowed no half measures or concessions to iniquity. He could not preach peace without first announcing judgment, for divine justice demanded reparation for all offenses against the moral law of the Eternal. His mission was an act of fidelity that cost him the peace of his soul, but guaranteed the redemption of many. The contrast of victory was clear and eternal. The small island of Patmos, the place of punishment and abandonment, became the mount of revelation, the furnace where the prophet's faith was tempered until it became unbreakable. The image of the giant angel, whose shadow covered the sea and the land, remained vivid in the minds of those who heard his account, reinforcing the idea that divine intervention is always greater and more glorious than human trial. The pain of exile was an investment from heaven, the price paid so that John could carry within himself the most powerful truth in all of human history. The narrator reveals that the indignation of the faithful in the face of the injustice of exile transformed into triumphant satisfaction upon seeing the prophet fulfill his mandate. The oppressors, in their fleeting arrogance, did not understand the web of designs that enveloped them, believing that their actions were motivated by their own will. However, John's humiliation was only one chapter, and his triumph was the inevitable conclusion of the saga of faith and obedience. He had passed the test, and now he was the instrument of the revelation of the divine purpose, the link between the ancient promise and its final fulfillment, a model of covenant and protection for all ages. The book of fire, which burned within, ensured that his preaching was not tedious or superficial, but an epic tale of redemption and confrontation. His language, though solemn and eloquent, was direct, focused on spiritual transformation and the turning of destiny guided by a higher will. The key sacred epic he narrated was his own life transmuted into prophecy, a man who, amidst suffering and solitude, chose obedience and faith, and was rewarded with the authority to announce the consummation of all things. The world could try to silence his voice, but it could not extinguish the fire that burned within him. John's final years were marked by intense writing and witnessing activity, strictly fulfilling the command to prophesy to many peoples and nations and languages and kings. His chronicle of redemption, born from the bitter sweetness of revelation, spread like wildfire, reaching the churches he loved and defying imperial censorship, the courts of the very kings who had condemned him. The malice of his antagonists only served to give prominence to his message. The evil they intended the eternal had turned into good, transforming their attempt at silence into a prophetic megaphone that would not cease to sound until the end of time. He never sought personal revenge against the oppressors who exiled him. His only motivation was divine justice, manifested in the exaltation of the faithful and the inevitable fall of the thrones of iniquity. The final shock for the skeptics was not only with the fulfillment of his prophecies, but with the unwavering serenity of the prophet, who, even bearing the fire and bitterness of judgment, spoke of a love that surpasses all pain. His life became the personification of triumph, a man who, instead of drowning in the self-pity of exile, chose to be a witness to the glory to come, fulfilling his legacy with a fidelity bordering on sacrifice. The gospel of the covenant, which John carried within him, did not allow for a superficial conclusion. Triumph was the inevitable fulfillment, the certainty that the promise would be realized not by chance, but by a meticulously planned design. The elder, the last of the great heralds, saw his life become an epic tale, an ancestral saga where trial was the preface, faith the central plot, and divine justice the grand denouement. He had immersed himself in the account of heaven, visualizing the before and after of humanity, and now, with the authority of one who had eaten the truth, he guided men towards the final turning point of destiny. The reverence his figure inspired was not due to his temporal power, for he had none, but to the fact that he was the recipient of the little book, the bearer of the bitter and sweet revelation. His story was the ultimate lesson on spiritual transformation. Suffering purifies the messenger, and blind obedience empowers the faithful for the fulfillment of the highest mission. He was the vivid contrast, human frailty confronted and transformed by the majesty of divine intervention, and his triumph was the eternal proclamation that loyalty to the eternal will never be in vain, and that the time of the fulfillment of the promise is marked by the oath of the giant angel. The cycle of trial and triumph was completed in John's longevity and authority, for divine justice is not manifested only in sudden acts of power, but in the miraculous preservation of his faithful amidst the storm. While the emperors who had condemned him fell, victims of their own ambitions and the fickleness of earthly fortune, the prophet who carried fire in his belly remained unshaken, the fixed point of a world in chaotic motion. The humiliation of Patmos was the crucible that made him indestructible, and each year of his extended life was a silent prophecy about the fleeting nature of human power and the eternity of the kingdom to come. His legacy was the testament that a man's greatest strength lies in his capacity to endure the pain of truth. The sweetness of the promise and the bitterness of judgment had balanced within him, transforming him into a compassionate yet relentless herald. He could not soften the message to please kings or nations, for he felt the burning of the little book, reminding him that every word spoken should be faithful to the revelation received. His life became an invitation to the covenant, a call for men to exchange fleeting ambition for the unwavering protection of the eternal. John's narrative about the giant angel and his oath that there will be no more delay instilled urgency in the spirits of those who heard him. This urgency was not a paralyzing terror, but a motivation for redemption. He made them visualize the colossal angel with one leg on the sea and the other on the land, so that they could feel the majesty of the intervention and the certainty that no corner of the world was beyond the reach of divine sovereignty. This dramatic description, born of his own ordeal, was the most effective weapon against the skepticism of the wise and the malice of the powerful. The prophet's transformation was a living metaphor for the victory of faith. He, who had been the youngest and most beloved of the disciples, became the oldest and most solemn of the prophets, a man who personified divine justice. The contrast between the mourning warning of exile and the glory of his final mission was proof that God uses adversity to forge his greatest instruments. In the end, his opponents could only feel the cold shock of their error and, for some, the belated regret of having mocked the one who carried the book of fire. The triumph was, therefore, the inevitability of the promise fulfilled in his ministry. The life of John, the prophet of Patmos, was the sacred epic of perseverance. He was not freed from suffering, but enabled to endure it, making his pain the most effective pulpit. The fire that burned within him was a constant reminder that the word was not his, but the Eternal's, and that his mission was greater than his own life. The ultimate triumph of his faith was not the absence of adversity, but the ability to transform trial into an unshakable testimony, a tale that uplifts morals and instills reverence for the sovereignty that governs heaven and earth. The chronicle of the Book of Fire became the hope of the marginalized, a hymn to divine justice that assures that the time of iniquity has a limit and that the oath of the giant angel will be fulfilled to the last comma. The solitude of exile became a beacon for the nations, showing that, even in apparent abandonment, the covenant of protection of the Eternal is stronger than all the forces of the empire. The contrast of victory was proof that the man humiliated by the world would be exalted by heaven to be the final herald of redemption. The prophet's voice echoed the authority of one who had nourished himself on truth, and therefore his preaching was captivating from beginning to end, forcing the reader to visualize the turning point in their destiny. He made the soul feel indignation at the injustice suffered and profound satisfaction at the triumph of his unwavering faithfulness. He did not digress. Each word was a step on the journey of spiritual transformation, a focus on the manifestation of God's faithfulness and the overcoming of trials, bringing the reality closer to an epic of redemption. The legacy that John left for future generations was not a mere memory, but a living prophecy, ensuring that his account of the vision of the angel, brighter than the sun, and the bitterness of the prophecy in his womb would be preserved with reverence. He fulfilled his mandate, and his life became the most eloquent proof that pain is a small price to pay for the honor of carrying the eternal word. Divine justice was established, and the story of the exiled prophet became the saga of the triumph of faith over temporal power, the epic of unconditional obedience. His narrative was a cry against oblivion, ensuring that the world would never forget the majesty of the intervention. His triumph was the certainty that the promise would be fulfilled, not by chance, but as an inevitable design, a cycle of trial, faith, and divine triumph. His body, which felt the fire and bitterness of the little book, rested in peace, but his voice, laden with the word, never fell silent again, echoing through the centuries with the same urgency as the giant angel's oath. Thus concludes the chronicle of the exiled prophet and the book that burned within. Loneliness and injustice were consumed by revelation and fidelity. Triumph was not the absence of the cross, but the crowning of obedience. The Epic of John is the final testimony that when man submits to the pain of truth, he becomes the herald of eternal victory. Reverence, indignation, and satisfaction unite in the contemplation of history, proving that the hand of the Eternal guides destiny and that the bitter word in the womb is transformed into the sweet certainty of redemption. The tale ends, but faith lives on. Subscribe, like, and be part of this mission to keep the light of truth burning.